we were running through this notion of the United States kind of trying to do something authentic and really trying to juxtapose this identity of the United States away from what it was in England and away from what it becomes in the French Revolution. And so I think there's a historical phenomenon that we have to kind of rationally wrestle with, and some of the ideas we have to wrestle with are ideas that were presented in the 17th century with the English Civil War, the ideas that are going to manifest in the American Revolution, and the ideas that manifest in the French Revolution. We tend to see three different kind of versions of Enlightenment thought emerge in this kind of new period. And this is important for us to kind of wrap our heads around, because as Americans, you have to determine whether or not your government, your nation, is effectively worth defending. This is a question, I think, that should compel us as Americans to say, if you were born in America, you are American by birth, you're a citizen of this country, is it worth defending? Is America an ideology, a system, a concept that you can kind of back? Or is there something about America we need to change, we need to alter? And so many kind of students come to my class are like, well, we need to change it, we need to alter it. But when I ask follow-up questions like why, what needs to be changed, what needs to be altered, most students can't answer those questions. They just like, it needs to be changed. It's bad. It was built by white slave-owning men. And I'm like, okay, that's an ad hominem fallacy, by the way. You're just attacking the person and not the idea, which doesn't really help us out. So if we're going to look at the American idea, we have to try to parse out the American Revolution and figure out what exactly happened. And this is complicated to do because we have a lot of shenanigans in the American Revolution. There's a lot about the American Revolution that isn't on the up and up, that just simply isn't the most noble behavior. The Boston Massacre overwhelmingly shows us some ill-advised behavior where the colonists are really acting impetuously, irrationally. They are very much on the cusp of doing something that really could have turned this nation in a very bad way. The Boston Tea Party. In fact, I often ask students, I'm like, can you name an event leading to the American Revolution that didn't happen in or around Boston? Right? You really do have this kind of like radical populist group in the Boston area that's really frustrating this entire narrative pushing towards war. And they are content with war, but the reality is they can't win the war without Southern support. They can't win the war without pulling the nations together. And so beyond the frustration of Boston, beyond the frustration of Patrick Henry and Sam Adams and Paul Revere, and these people that have been put into our history books as quote-unquote patriots, which I would be very, very careful before I assign that title to them, by the way. But it's other men that often are off the radar that actually make this work. Men like John Adams, men like Benjamin Franklin, men like Governor Edmund Randolph, men that willingly came together and tried to petition for redress, tried to make it work with England, tried to formulate an agreement and a peace so that we could avoid war. Once the war takes hold, though, now we have to look at those men navigating the war. Individuals like George Washington, which is so critically important, but it's not by accident that a Virginian writes the Declaration of Independence. And it's not by accident that George Washington, a Virginian, leads the American Revolutionary Forces. In fact, behind the scenes, you had a individual that really was frustrated in his legacy for 250 years of American history by the name of John Adams. The same individual that defended the soldiers at the Boston Massacre is still critically important here, right? He's there representing Boston at the Declaration of Independence, and it was his idea to put Jefferson in charge of writing the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because if this is just a northern battle with England, we lose. If this is just Boston fighting against the king, then the hammer stroke of England is going to come down hardest on Boston, and Boston is going to be obliterated. If we're going to win, if we're going to succeed, we have to find a narrative, we have to find a cause that is adequately going to bring in a unification of the states. And if you're going to bring in a unification of the states, then you're going to have to find something by which the South can gravitate towards. Which is why it's critically important that Jefferson be the one that wrote this. So a lot of ideas that Jefferson gets credit for, Jefferson is pulling these ideas from the Enlightenment He's pulling these ideas from Locke. This is basically plagiarism of John Locke. You also have other Enlightenment thinkers like Brillo McKee. There's a lot of ideas here that have been cycling around for 100 years. Jefferson kind of gives us a concise element of these ideas. I know I stole your desk. I apologize. I'm trying to get it working where it's okay, and it's just I'm sorry. Right? But if you can figure out how to get that mic to work, then I will move it back. I don't know. It's nasty. Nonetheless, so when we're looking at this, there's a reason why Adams is like, hey, Jefferson, right, needs to write this. Why? Because Jefferson's from Virginia. And if for Virginian writes the Declaration of Independence, and if you can pull Virginia in, you pull Virginia into the conflict, right? When we're saying, well, we need a continental force, and Adams is the one that says, hey, what about George Washington? Well, if George Washington's leading the Continental Army, now I have a Virginian leading the Continental Army. So much of our mentality on this is like, no, we have the Boston Tea Party, and this is what unified us. No, the Boston Massacre divided us. The Boston Tea Party divided us. It was other, more somber negotiation. It was diplomacy of a different type that's pulling our nation together behind the scenes in spite of our efforts to kind of rip it apart and destroy it. And we see so much of that leading into this conception of the Declaration of Independence. And so we started to dive into the Declaration and what it is, why it is. Also, John Marshall. John Marshall is critically important already. His ideas have largely been kind of escaped over. He's like, well, he was the first Chief Justice. He is already playing in this. Even though Madison is known as the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, Marshall arguably had as much, if not more, to do with the Bill of Rights than Madison did, but Madison still gets credit. Both of them from Virginia, by the way. And so when you start looking at this, Virginia is going to be pulled into this conflict by virtue of this larger, broader argument. And the argument centers on this Enlightenment theory of individual rights, that you are endowed by your Creator with rights, and among those rights in your life, your ability to choose and the pursuit of happiness. And if you understand that conceptually, then you get to choose your government. You get to decide whether or not your government is worth your allegiance. And that is a powerful construct. So you don't actually have to just act under servitude of the government you were born into, that you have an obligation to analyze that government, to look at that government, to piece that government apart and ask yourself, is this a government that I am willing, right, to consent to? Is this a government that balances the power? Is this a government that adequately protects my ability to pursue longevity and viability in this thing? Just notice Buzz Lightyear, by the way, very nice. So when we start looking at this, this is something that we have to ask ourselves when looking at government. If you're wondering, like, that's where my brain goes. Like, as I'm scanning the room, I'm like, teachers notice a lot more than you think, and sometimes I just comment on them. All right, so now whenever any form of government, so we're going to see that we have life, we have liberty, we have pursuit of happiness, and then we should be able to consent to the government. Well, what happens when we have a government act against your consent? Right, this is powerful. Right? And it's powerful specifically today because I think what you have when government acts against the consent of the people, you can guarantee a certain rebellion will manifest within that government. Right, guys? People try to explain Donald Trump. Why was Donald Trump elected? Why did we have him so popular? Guys, in my humble estimation, right, there's one easy reason why Donald Trump was elected. Because we fundamentally never consented to Barack Obama's policies. We liked Barack Obama, the person. We did not like his policies. Even when the Affordable Care Act was passed, a majority of Americans did not support the Affordable Care Act, and it was passed anyway. When you start invoking on the American people aspects and laws against the consent, there will be a reaction to that. There will be a response to that. Right? And this becomes problematic. So Donald Trump, as president, what does he do? He goes on as president, he gets 3 Supreme Court justices, and majority of Americans were not in favor of the conservative nature of those 3 Supreme Court. So guess what we saw in the next presidential election? We saw a reaction against the absence of proper consent, proper buy-in for those 3 Supreme Court selections.
They were perceived as Republican push-throughs. They were perceived as conservative push-throughs, and we saw a reaction to that in the 2020 election, right? So we start looking at this idea of governments are built by the consent of the people, and if you do not secure consent, then we tend to have a rebellion. We tend to have a reaction. All right, this is something I think is so important as parents. One of the guiding themes of my parenting is never do anything without the consent of my kids. And this bothers parents. Like, no, I don't have to get my kids' consent. All right, I'm mom, I'm dad. I can do whatever I want to. I have the authority. Right? And I always tell them, like, how's that working for you? How does this work? Is that working well? When mom and dad come in and say, I'm mom, I'm dad, you will do what I'm told. How long does that work for you? Eventually, what happens every single time? Rebellion. Every single time. Almost without fail. Generally begins to manifest in the junior high years. It's overwhelmingly present in the teenage year, which is why we call it teenage rebellion. Now, some rebellion is obvious. Some rebellion is what we call active rebellion, right? It's actually active. It's coming across in violent outcries. It's coming across in sneaking out. It's coming across as direct confrontations with the authority. We see this in the Boston Massacre. We see this in the Boston Tea Party. We see this in a lot of things. But a lot of other, if I have a manifestation of active rebellion, I guarantee you there's a larger percentage somewhere that's in passive rebellion. Right? Passive rebellion is different. It's not active, it's not obvious, but if you're paying attention to it, you can see it, right? This is why I think it's so fascinating to study relationships. Because if I have any relationship, I can tell, is this a sound relationship? Well, the question is it a balanced relationship, and are each one in open consent of the relationship, yes or no? If they are not, if it's an unbalanced relationship, if one or the other is taking too much power in this relationship, you're going to see evidence of rebellion on the other hand. Sometimes, like I said, it gets into outward actions. We see fights, we see arguments, we see like, I don't have to, we see you're just crazy and I'm leaving. A lot of times, all right, especially if you go see older couples, you see passive rebellion. You see a lot of snide comments under the breath, like, you never let me do anything when I want to do anything. Right? You know, I don't know, do what you want to do because that's what we always do. Right? When you see those comments, that is a sign of an unhealthy contract, and that's on the verge of breaking down. Right? If you're cognizant and see this, right, that's a verge of breaking down. So when parents have teenagers like, oh no, my teenager's really compliant, they've never acted out. But I'll look at the teenager like, whatever, mom. Like the eye rolls and the whatever, mom, that's passive rebellion. There's already something going on there. That teenager is not, they're not seen. They're not being consented to. They haven't been given the opportunity to say, yes, I accept this, right? It's really kind of weird when you have to break that mentality, right? Because people are like, yeah, but Crosby, you can't do this. You have to be an authority of your kids. Do you? I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and about to be a 12-year-old, right? And I've asked him, like, I can't make you. You can choose. Right? Here's what you get to do. And I haven't had any issues. But it takes time. It takes time. I often use the example, bring this up in my work as well, that the difference of this is saying like this. If you're sitting down on the couch playing video games, and your dad comes home from a long day of work, right, and he looks at you, he's angry, he's upset, right, he's running late, you say, man, get up off your lazy butt and go do the yard. Like, you're just sitting around all day, right? That's one way to handle that argument. What happens if your dad comes in next and says, hey, buddy, man, I'm late, I got to get dinner on, I really got to get the yard, the HOA is just on my butt about it, would you mind taking 30 minutes and help me out there? I would really appreciate it. Both of the scenarios produces a mowed yard. What's the difference in the scenarios?
The way he asked.
But what's the difference with the way he asked?
One of them was aggressive.
Huh? Not just aggressive, what happened? If the dad comes in and says, hey, get up off your lazy butt and do, what does the dad do to the authority structure, the power balance in the relationship? He subjects his son as a lesser being. You do what you're told. I'm dad, you're son. You're down here, I'm up here. If I request of him, what do? I elevate him to my equal. I elevate. Like, hey, will you help me out? I need a favor from you. I need your assistance. When you start looking at power struggles and the aspects of power, one of the fascinating elements of human existence is human beings are actually very willing to help most of the time, so long as you do not demean them when asking. When you start demeaning human beings, that's when you're like, no, even if they do the job, like, whatever, it's angry, it's frustrating, you see that rebellion emerge. If you ask them, if you see them, right, and then afterwards, right, if you actually elevate them, and he gets up, go mows the yard, comes back in, now what do you need to do? Well, what would you want if you went out and mowed the yard as a favor? You would want some type of acknowledgement, some type of appreciation. Hey, buddy, appreciate that. Thank you so much. You know how much that goes? You know how far that goes? Like parents, for the life of me, and teachers, for the life of me, and principals, they can't figure this out. If you want right action from your kid, acknowledge and affirm right action. But how often do we only acknowledge our kids when they're doing something wrong or when we're lording over them? When we only see them because they're problems, when they're being lazy. But if you start acknowledging, you did something good, hey, nicely done, I like that, well done. Very early I started practicing this. So my son would watch me and I would hold the door open for the family and I would let them all through. My son watching me, my kids watching me, right? So from very early, it's like 9, 10, 11, 12, my son started grabbing the door before me and opening the door for me, right? And so instead of saying, I got it, but I'm like, hey, appreciate it, buddy. Nice and done. I like that. Nice and done. Good job. I'm going to get this door in here. And so you model the behavior and you affirm. To this end, you allow that reciprocation of authority, that reciprocation of power, this ability to, I'm going to go out of my way and do something, but I'm doing it on my terms. I'm doing it on my consent. When you have a system that does not secure that, or when your system destroys that, when you're in a system that you feel like it doesn't even matter if I do good, I'm going to get in trouble. It doesn't matter if I do right, I'm going to get in trouble. Right? It doesn't matter what I do. One day I get in trouble, the other day I don't. Guys, inconsistent parenting is one of the greatest plagues on the modern generation. Inconsistent parenting is one of the greatest plagues on modern children. Parents that one day allow you to get away with it, and the next day they're jumping down your throat and penalizing you for it. Because what that does is it communicates to the kid that there is no stability. There is no predictability. So there's nothing that they can really consent to because the contract is always changing. I don't have the same expectations. One of the reasons we have a constitution is to guarantee security of the contract, and the guarantee of the security of the contract is so you know what you're consenting to. It's also one of the arguments later on in class why I don't think the Supreme Court should overturn almost anything, right, ever. Why? Because anything you do to change the contract breeds inconsistency with the ability to consent to that contract. You need stability and consistency so you, the people, know what exactly you're consenting to. You don't change it without that consent. When you become destructive to that consent, it is a right of the people to alter or abolish it, right? And laying down new foundations, such principles, organizing its power in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So we've got this kind of development of government should be elected by the people. You should be able to consent to that government. When a government's not there by consent or is destructive to your consent, then we should alter or abolish it. He goes on, he says, but prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. So now we're fighting this battle of, what if people just look at the American government and say, yeah, aren't y'all just mad? Aren't you like just a bunch of stupid teenagers arguing and rebelling over something stupid? Pay your taxes and shut up. I mean, really, what substantial do we have in the revolution? And in my humble estimation, if we keep teaching the American Revolution of no taxation or representation, the entire fight was over taxes, guys, we embolden a whole new generation of January 6th rebellion every time we teach that lesson. Why? Because we're teaching people that if you ever are inconvenienced by the government, that's a platform for rebellion. If you're ever somehow twerked or irked by the government, that's a position of rebellion. And Jefferson is saying, no, that's not. Just because you're mildly inconvenienced, just because the government does something wrong or mildly wrong, that's not. Prudence. Anybody know what the word prudence means? Careful, cautious, thoughtful. When you are prudent, you don't run into things quickly. You don't rush into things. You carefully think things through. So Jefferson has given this idea that when a government, right, has violated this right, you do have the right to overthrow that government, alter the government to your end. But prudence, caution, should be our guide. You shouldn't rush into rebellion. And he has to make this argument to show again the world that we're not rushing into this rebellion, right? We're not rushing into this. We've thought this through. He says that accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing forms which they are accustomed. In other words, Jefferson is telling the world we're not doing this haphazardly. We're not doing this accidentally. We're not doing this because we're mad, we're upset. We're not doing this because we're temporarily frustrated. There is a foundational wrong occurring in the United States, and we are seeking to correct this wrong. Right? And what's fascinating about this, I mentioned this yesterday, whether they got this perfectly right or not, the founding fathers understood that the British citizens proper were demeaning them as lesser citizens. We see this in the history. We see this in the denial of representation. We see this in the denial of legal aspects in courts. We see them kicked off of contracts. We see a separation between those members of Britain proper and the American colonists. And so they were fighting for their specific rights. Right? Now, did they understand how what they were fighting for also necessarily applied to women, African Americans, and immigrants? The answer to that equation is no, obviously. They knew how it applied to them, which is a cautionary tale to us. Guys, many of us will get frustrated by evils that happen to us, and we remain blind to the evils that we turn around and incur on other people, even if they are the exact same. When we start looking at the American founding fathers, yeah, we could say they're white, they're wrong, they're slave owners. All of that is ad hominem. Were they wrong, though? Were they wrong? Is this not the proper formation of government? So when we look at these, we're not abolishing this because something small or trivial has happened. England has repeatedly, over the last 100 years, continued to treat us as second-rate citizens, continue to kick us out of the political environment, continue to ostracize us and belittle us, even though we have shown time and time and time again that we're as intelligent and as capable of governing ourselves as they are. He goes on, but when a long trend of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object invents a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is a right, it is a duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. Like I said in the beginning, this is one of the most eloquent breakup letters we have. I'm breaking up with you because God gives me the right to pursue a happy, healthy relationship. This is what a happy, healthy relationship looks like. And I have the obligation to myself to pursue one. Now, we shouldn't break up relationships out of something small or trivial, but when a long series of abuse in a given relationship continues without resolve, without change, without modification, you push me to a point where I have no other option other than to leave and to secure a new relationship. Well, is all of this true? Jefferson then hits us with, to prove this, guys, he's not just making a theoretical argument. He's saying this is what's happened, this is what's theoretically true, this is what the king has done. And to prove this, he goes on for like 3 pages on everything the king has done over the last 30, 40, 50 years that actually violate. It's like, I'm not abusive, prove it. Like, fine, I will prove it. You did this, you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this. Don't forget that time you did this, 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 you did this. You did this, you did this, you did do this, you did this, you did, and literally just goes on, list by list by list by list by list by list by list. Remember, this isn't written to the king. The king didn't even read it, didn't even open it. He didn't even read the olive branch petition sent previously. Our last attempt for peace. This was written to the world. So if anybody's looking at our cause, our plight, they would see an America that was noble. an America that had just cause. And that's something I think we're still kind of fighting. Are we living in a nation of America that has just cause? He wraps up this end. He says, in every stage of the oppression, we have petitioned for redress in those humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only with repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked, and every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. I actually use that last line in my arguments from parenting, because if you actually use that last line and say, a parent whose character is thus marked, and every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free child. If you actually interpret that and actually extend that, like if you actually kind of wrap your head around this, if every action of your authority is used to belittle and demean those around you, then are you fit to govern? One of the things I thought was surprising after the 2008 election, spoiler alert, I did not vote for Barack Obama. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I have not in my adult life been able to cast a presidential vote for somebody I thought qualified for the office. So just gonna throw that out there. So when I use presidential examples, it's not meant to demean or belittle, it's meant to just provide an example of leadership. After the 2008 election, Barack Obama had just beat John McCain in the 2008 election, and they were in a White House conference meeting. And I thought it was fascinating that in this White House conference meeting, John McCain was at the table, still a senator. Barack Obama was now president of the United States. And they got into an exchange, they got into a debate where McCain said, wait, we've got to keep this under wraps, we've got to keep this in our purview. And Barack Obama looked at John McCain and says, hey, John, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I won the election. And I watched that live and I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Did you? All right. And that set the tone for Obama's presidency. And so what did we have? We had a very tumultuous presidency. We had a massive rebellion in 2010 when Obama lost the House of Representatives. He eventually lost the Senate in 2014. Right? The Republicans would storm back in 2016, but the Republicans didn't learn any lessons. So when Trump became president, guess what Trump did? Trump did almost the exact same thing. I'm president, I'm CEO, I'm in charge. That's not how you govern. You've got to learn to govern by consent. You have to learn diplomacy. You have to learn how to reach out, how to get people to get along, to find the periods of overlap and walk through that. If your character is in every action that of a tyrant, if you're just wheeling and dealing and manipulating to your own ends, then arguably you are unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So we have this argument. Hobbes, the sovereign should rule. Rousseau, the mob should rule. Locke, the just should rule. The best should rule. The most knowledgeable, the most virtuous should rule. And so we see this kind of element playing out in the historic element. And this is something that we cannot discount because there's an argument that we have to play into. And the argument goes back to an Aristotelian argument, right? So Locke is one of the elements, but this idea that the just should rule, right, is an idea we'll play out here in a minute when we're setting up the Constitution. But we're going to play out that conception, right? Because there's an argument still that if I'm not going to give power to the mob completely and conform to the mob, and I'm not going to give power to the king and conform to the king, I'm going to conform to this middle body, then you have to kind of entertain this argument then, I will consent to leadership, but ask yourself this, does everybody, and everybody wants to be in charge. I don't think that's true, right? When I see this kind of conception of everybody wants to be in charge, I don't think that's true. I think most people don't want to be in charge. I think some people are terrified to be in charge. And I think some of the worst people that are outgoing, right? Talked to my wife the other day, actually yesterday, about this. So one of the greatest travesties about education is we reward those students that are naturally outgoing. That they're really good about being charismatic and whatnot. And we're like, oh, they can show up on presentation day and look really good, but they don't do anything else. Like the sad thing about education is that we don't actually reward the students who get stuff done, who don't need me micromanaging them. They don't always look great on presentation day because they're terrified of this kind of like large group presentation kind of idea. But if you look at the quality of the work when I'm not micromanaging them, those are your best leaders. They know how to work in small assemblies and know how to get stuff done. right? But they don't always know. But we reward what? We reward the little girl that can get up on there on church Sunday morning and sing. And then she's, oh, look, she's just a darling and whatnot. What about the little girl who doesn't like to sing? What about her that just likes to read books and put circuits together? Right? Who doesn't just perform when other people give her praise? What about that girl? When we start looking at leadership and how we select leader, in my humble estimation, the greatest detriment to the evolution of of the American experiment for the good is our inability to decide what makes a good leader and to select them. Right? That's a theme that's going to run through this class over and over and over and over and over again. If I'm not going to conform to the mob, if I'm not going to conform to an absolute government, if I'm going to conform and consent to a ruling elite, who should make up that ruling elite? How do we decide the most just leaders? That's a big question that we have yet been able to answer effectively. So we go into the revolution and we won. Right? Spoiler alert, we win the revolution. We should not have, but we did. Right? And I say we should have because, guys, we should have. By any stretch of imagination, we should not have beat Britain in this war. The reason we beat Britain is happenstance, luck. We have some courageous efforts by individuals that begin to turn the tide. The biggest reason we win this war is, I would argue that Britain is fundamentally tired of fighting. Remember, they have just fought the 7 Years' War. They have been fighting for 100 years. They're already piled up with war debt. And Britain is there looking at this saying, you know what, is this even worth it? Do we get enough from these colonies to continue this fight? And the narrative in Britain is, fine, let's back off, let's end this war, let's let the colonists run themselves. Because from the British point of view, if I let the colonies run themselves, it's only going to be a matter of time before they come back running to Britain for help and support. So fine, I'm going to cut you off, right? Fine, you win the war. And so he praised this kind of war and saying, yay, we won the American Revolution, woo! But were we able to govern ourselves at that point? Were we effective at governing ourselves? Could we actually establish some kind of international presence? And so we have to kind of take a critical analysis of the war and the aftermath. The first thing we know is this. We know by virtue of going to war with Britain, we did not accept the Hobbesian form of government. We know this, right? Because Hobbes says you can never revolt. So the action that we took against the King of England, right? The action that we overwhelmingly fought against the established social contract, that overwhelmingly tells us that we are not going to erect a Hobbesian form of government. So we have two options left. Rousseau, still lingering that the mob should lead, the mob is good, the mob, like everything wrong with America was England. Americans are good because we are the oppressed, that we can govern ourselves reasonably and rationally. Or Locke, that says we still need to be governed by an intellectual way and wisdom elite. Like I said at the beginning of class, I am still Locke. Right? To this day, I am Locke. Right? Just so everybody is clear, I do not think that everybody having a right to vote is a good thing for any politic. Right? I don't. Massive ignorant voters destroys every nation that tolerates them. It just never works. Ever. Right? Ever. So my argument is always we need wise, intelligent leadership, which means we need a system that can produce wise, intelligent leadership. Right? When we look at the government today, like, well, the government's always fighting. I'm like, of course they are. The people are always fighting. Well, they can't agree on anything. Of course, we can't agree on anything. Well, they're always, of course, we're doing that. Ask yourself, the government ran even recently the debt ceiling. Like, oh, they're just spending too much money. They're always in debt. Of course, we're spending too much money and we're in debt. Have you looked at the average debt of the personal American? Do we know how to stay within our finances? Are we very good about only spending what we make? Yeah, right? So of course, we want to live on credit. We want to expand everything. We want everything, so we have a government. We elect politicians that give us what? Exactly what we want. We have no idea where money comes from. We have no idea about inflation. We have no idea about internal currency exchanges. Guys, the average American knows very little about the structural integrity of any country. They vote based on what evils are perceived to their being. And that's a very slippery slope to bad government. Because then you just have politicians that pander to that. Oh, you feel bad? Well, let me give you this. Oh, let me do this. Guys, even right now, the forgiveness of student loans. Well, we just need student loan forgiveness. Guys, that's a play out. Who are you attracting? Right? 18 to 28, those of y'all that have high student loans. Because you're like, hey, I'll vote for that. I'll vote for that. But is it right? Is it just? Well, they didn't know what they were signing up for. They still signed up for it. Like, you still went to college. Just because you didn't know what you were doing, when does that let you off? When you go to criminal court, like, well, I didn't know it was wrong, and that gives you a pass? Never, right? And if we're going to pay off academic student loans, what happens to the people who didn't go to academics, who said, you know what, I'm going to build a big truck. I'm going to take out a big loan, and I'm going to become a trucker, and that's what I'm going to do with my life. Should the government pay off that truck? That truck costs as much as your education. Why aren't we helping those guys out? Are they not more critically important to our economy than most of y'all with a degree? Some of you are like, you're a college professor making fun of degrees. Yes. Yes. Because so much of education has become business, we're selling you that. A lot of people with high advanced degrees didn't do a whole lot of work to get them, they paid a lot for them. Why? New academic model, it's a business model. So what happened to the integrity of academics? We democratized it out. You democratize any system, and you're going to lower the value of that system. Happens every single time. Mentioned the Affordable Care Act a while ago, and some people are like, so Crosby, you weren't in favor of the Affordable Care Act? I'm like, no, not really. They're like, why? Like, it's not that hard. The only government-run healthcare we had prior to the Affordable Care Act was the Veterans Affairs. How effective is it? How well is the VA run? You tell me.
So.
Do we want the VA to be a model of all American healthcare? For me, I'm like, nah. Long waiting lines, can't get in. When you do get a thing, you got to cancel everything just to take it because you're not going to get in for another 6 months. There's not a lot of positives about the VA, but instead of looking at the federal government saying what you're doing isn't working that well, that's my criteria. It's like education. Okay, let's put the government in charge of education. The federal government is completely in charge of one district. The District of Washington, D.C. schools is under the direct control of Washington, D.C. How well is it? D.C. consistently works as one of the worst school districts in the nation. And yet we're like, oh yeah, let's expand federal control of schools. The question is it working well? Is what they're doing working? When we start looking at these narratives, we have to begin having a more honest conversation about who do we have in power and how do we get the right people in power, and can we simply trust the people to construct magically this great outcry? Do we actually pick the best? Right? How many of y'all watch American Idol or the singing show of any type? You've seen them? Okay, how many of y'all know of them?
I know them.
All right, okay. All right, let me ask you a question. All those shows built this premise on democratization of competition, right? So we're going to let you vote. You can call in right now. And by the way, this is nothing more or less than marketing, right? If you call in right now, call in and vote, call in and vote, call in and vote. Text your vote too. Why? Because that keeps you hooked. Who won the vote? It keeps you coming back for more. All of this, if I get you voting on day one, I get you coming back to see the results of the vote on day two. All of this is engineering. I'm going to walk myself out of the phone. Right? So when you start looking at this, here's what I always think is fascinating about those singing shows. Almost never does the best singer win. Almost never. Every one of those shows is set up the same way. They don't give you the best singers. American Idol doesn't have the 12 best singers in the United States. They typecast their singers based on the largest populations that are likely to watch the show. Which is why we always have the rocker. We always have the soul. We always have, the country guy with his guitar and his beard. We have to typecast, right, enough of a variation so that we pull every demographic we're trying to pull in. And then you gravitate to whatever musical, lyrical thing you find best. I like the country, so I'm the African American soul. I'm going to vote for the African American on the show. Are they the best singer though? No, but they're black. Racist. Is he the best singer? It doesn't matter. I like him because he's country. But is he the best? It's a singing competition. No, it's an entertainment. So is that what's best? Do we select leaders simply by who entertains us more? And is any government going to survive as long as we hold that down? Because what have we had? Donald Trump knew this very well. So the American people want to be what? Entertained. So he gave us what? 2 very entertaining elections. Right? His Twitter following is entertaining. You don't have to like him. It's entertaining. Donald Trump purposely put controversial and nonsensical stuff out there. Why? Because it was, it gave us something. Guys, actually, Joe Biden won the election in 2020 by effectively saying nothing. If Donald Trump would just not have pushed the limits, he would have won in 2020. But he bought into this narrative. How do we select good people? Our first government we tried is called the Articles of Confederation. Another thing we obviously miss in the development of American history is the fact that our first attempt to govern ourselves failed and failed miserably. We did not do a great job up front. In my book, A More Perfect Parent, I lead with this in the first book. Because everybody's like, well, a more perfect parent. That's kind of pretentious. You're trying to tell every parent how to be perfect. I'm like, that's not what I said. I said a more perfect. And the reason why parents need to gravitate to more perfect than not perfect is this. Because you are going to fail. I promise you. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. The moment you have children, you are destined to fail at something. I promise you, you will screw up. There are times where you're going to do stuff with your kids. You're going to be like, man, I should not have done that. Man, I missed that. And you're going to have to be able to develop the maturity and wisdom to realize when you messed up. When we started the Articles of Confederation, we were almost like, it was kind of like a rebound relationship for us. So we have this kind of immediate, like, overwhelming presence of the king. So here we are, and I've got this relationship, and this relationship is abusive, it's totalitarian, he wants everything his way. And so what we do is we break up with him, and we go with who? We go with this Rousseauian notion. We go with the complete opposite. We almost run as far from the king as we can. And because we ran as far from the king as we can, we actually developed a system of government that was a very free and open, and everybody gets to decide what they want to do. It's actually at one point called a firm league of friendship, that everybody just kind of naturally agreed, and if it was imperative for us to do it, we would just naturally agree to it. We would naturally get along. And so we have this conception that our nation is going to be so noble, then the people of every state are just going to naturally agree on the most important things. And we're not going to need almost any leadership, any dynamic authority from Washington at all. Right? We're just going to naturally kind of gravitate together and accomplish the things we need to accomplish. Right? This is kind of taken from the idea of a democracy. Demos meaning people, kratos meaning power. So in a true democracy, the people have the power. And in the Articles of Confederation, the people held more power than at any other point in American history, right? Including today, right? The problem of the Articles, I'm going to argue, is this. Under the Articles, the people had too much power, and it nearly killed us as a nation. We have not kind of interpreted that idea. The Articles of Confederation said, hey, every state's going to be every state. Y'all decide how to run states. Our nation is only going to be made up of a loose assembly of lawmakers. We're not going to have a president. We're not going to have an executive. We're not going to have a Supreme Court. Right? Ultimately, our nation is going to be made up of a loose kind of confederation of states, and that's all it is. When we talk about the Confederate, a lot of people use that word Confederacy only to mean the American South going into the Civil War and during the Civil War. A confederacy is just a loose connection of states. So there is no contract holding them all together, but they have a general agreement to act together under certain terms. Right? So we have a confederacy was effectively the first government of the United States. Guys, this is why this is important. Because the South, right, like the Confederacy, which is why going into the Civil War, it's the South that's going to say, no, we want to go back to what? The Confederacy. We want to go back to more local support, more power to the people, more popular demands. We want less from Washington and more from the people. The South, right, has kind of championed this democratic narrative, which is why we have Jacksonian democracy and Jeffersonian democracy. Both of them were Southerners, still leading this notion that the people can be trusted, the people should be trusted. It's the North that's going to have more of this sentiment of saying, no, there still needs to be a guiding light. There still needs to be leadership and wisdom in government, right? And this is going to be a big kind of divide leading all the way up to the Civil War. Nonetheless, the Articles of Confederation gave us a lot of things that were problematic. First off, unicameral House. We simply had basically 3 delegates from every state. Those 3 delegates would meet in assembly. They would vote on stuff, but the problem is you couldn't do anything. In order to pass any legislation, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree, which they rarely had, right? The other thing they needed was you had to have a unanimous agreement of the states to change this agreement. Guys, what happens at the Articles of Confederation is we adopt this in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. By the 1780s, it's very clear it's not functioning. It got us through the war, and historians argue this all the time to me, like, oh no, it was effective enough to get us through the war. Guys, it wasn't. But we got through the war for one reason and one reason alone: survival, right? Survival. If you have a common enemy, you bind together, not because you have a great constitutional document, you bind together because you're going to die if you don't. That's what got us through the war. After the war was over, all of that animosity and frustration between the colonies that was there before the war reemerged. Guys, just because we fought England, New York doesn't like Pennsylvania anymore. Virginia doesn't like North Carolina anymore. They fought together in the war, yeah, but they still have vehement disagreements, which is why sports teams today still carry that. Have you ever wondered why we have the rivalries we have? New York Giants versus New York Jets. Why does New York hate New Jersey? Why do New Jerseyans hate New York? Why does New York hate those from Pennsylvania? Where did those rivalries come from? Guys, we still have a deep-seated kind of locality that does manifest in a healthy or unhealthy way. And so just because we won this war, it didn't eliminate, it didn't unify us, it didn't give us a cause bigger than ourselves. We went back to this kind of tribalistic states' rights kind of argument, and it nearly ruined us. It got so bad that Congress just stopped meeting. 1780s, we had effectively no national government. They just stopped meeting. Wasn't worth it. Wasn't worth meeting. 1780s, they began to try to get a congressional assembly together to fix this. 1785, they attempted it in a town called Annapolis. And when a group of men got together for the purpose of changing this, correcting it, making it better, they were literally run out of town by a mob threatening their life. They were argued to be usurpers. They were argued to be tyrants. They were argued to be political manipulatives trying to take over the nation. A random mob ran them out of town. The next year in 1786, they met again, trying to get enough states there. Time began to show that our government was not functioning, that we were not going to survive very long with this. And Britain was sitting back licking their chops. Remember, France is still up and down the Mississippi River. Spain is still to our south, right? England is still in Canada, right? True story, they're still there. And these nations are sitting there waiting for us to fall apart. Because it's happening. It's happening right in front. The world is sitting back waiting for Americans to shoot themselves. And we're doing a really good job of it. During this time period, you had states in almost outright warfare with each other. Land disputes between the states, economic disputes between the states. New York would actually take their ships and blockade the harbors so that any international trade would come in through New York and they would sell it at jacked up prices to their neighbors. We had open warfare between the states, and we're falling apart, and the rest of the world is just waiting for us to show that, see, Americans are ignorant, Americans are dumb, this isn't going to work. 1787, we finally got together, because we have to do something. Guys, one of the biggest issues, too, is this issue here. We couldn't lay or collect taxes, and we couldn't raise an army. An army was a wing of tyranny. Remember, who were the perpetrators of the Boston Massacre? It was the soldiers. Once you get rid of your soldiers, what army do you have? Guys, you got to think this stuff through. We didn't. Under Articles of Confederation, we're like, just get rid of them. Guys, even some Americans right now are like, just get rid of the cops. Get rid of the cops. Guys, before you make the argument, get rid of the cops, go look at 911 call origins. How many 911 calls come out of high-end white communities? And how many 911 calls come out of low-end, more impoverished communities? In other words, the very same groups of people that demand the cops' assistance the most is the same group demanding that we get rid of the cops. When you start analyzing this, if you get rid of your military, France has not left, Spain has not left, Britain has not left, and we can't raise any military. The other big problem is this: all those men that left their houses and homes to serve in the American Revolutionary War, we promised them. We said, hey, you serve the war, we'll pay you. When we win this war, we will pay you. So we have all of these soldiers now that fought the war, they're done, they're ready, and they come to our government and say, hey, we're ready for our pay. They can't raise taxes. Can't tax. So the government doesn't have any money to pay them. As if you're a military personnel, you're like, wow, we get screwed all the time. America's been screwing military personnel for a long time. One of the first actions we did is screw the military. All those promises we made, so here's what we did. Served in the war. I owe you $20. There you go. Whenever we get the money, you come see us. It got so bad that wealthy profiteers, she had money, she didn't need it. She needed money right away. So she starts looking at these soldiers and saying, hey, I'll give you $2 for that $20 government certificate. Bond profiteering. And she's in a situation, which is better, $2 now or the hope of $20 sometime in the future? And we had a lot of wealthier Americans start buying all these bond certificates, profiteering on the bottom dollar. So not only are we not paying the soldiers, we're actually profiteering from them. Guys, when you look at American history, right, I don't want to paint this picture that everything we did is wrong, but I also don't want to give you the idea that everything we did was right. And one of the worst periods in our history is when we trusted the people to do the right thing. Because when push comes to shove, we don't see that narrative play out. We didn't. When we asked people, hey, states, we need money to pay our soldiers. Remember, they can't raise taxes, but they can request of the states. Dear Virginia, we need money to pay soldiers. Please send money, hugs and kisses, federal government. Dear federal government, we have our own problems. Go screw yourself. Love, Virginia. We can't raise an army, but we can request that the states assist by sending militia forces. Dear New Hampshire, Georgia is being attacked by Native Americans on the western side. Please send troops to assist with the border control. Dear federal government, nobody cares about Georgians. Let them die. Hugs and kisses, federal government. Or New Hampshire. As we had this grand experiment for almost 10 years. Democracy. Let people decide. And we nearly ripped each other apart. 1786, we still don't have consensus. We have 13 colonies pulling at each other. We have a government that's not working. How do we know it's not working? Don't take my word for it. You do the history. You go research this. James Madison, father of the Constitution, said laws of the states are merely recommendatory for the citizens. What security, what probability would exist that they would be carried into execution? In other words, if you pass any law, if you're a parent and you're like, you know what, we're going to pass a rule, but you get to decide when you want to follow it, when you don't. So people always ask me like, well, Crosby, though, don't you have that? Don't you give your kids consent? Don't they have to consent to rules? Yeah, but they consent in advance. So we sit down at the table and we write rules for the house. Once we write rules for the House, we also come up with punishments when those rules are broken. I then enforce those rules, but I'm not enforcing the rules I made unilaterally. I'm enforcing the rules they made based on the punishments they thought fair. If you just give the people to openly decide whatever they want to follow, you follow, whatever you don't want to follow, you don't have to follow, what government do you have? George Washington, heard of him? Pretty important, maybe a good authority on the matter. He says the situation of the general government under the Articles of Confederation, if it can be called a government. Notice, I love the jab, right? We never give these historic figures enough credit for just kind of sometimes the humor that they had. They jabbed back and forth, and they had some very subtle jabs, and it's fun. So I never argue that we should take away the jabs out of politics. Sometimes politics needs a little jab. You need a little back and forth. In fact, there's a healthy back and forth. I would actually argue that every great relationship has a healthy back and forth. Like if you don't have some sarcastic humor, there's a little bit of fun there. So Washington is jabbing. He's saying that, you know, the situation of this government, if we even can call that. I'm not even sure that we can call the Articles of Government. That's where George Washington is in 1785. I'm not even sure we can call this a government. I'm not even sure that it qualifies as a government. Is shaken to its foundation, liable to be overturned, every blast. In a word, it is at an end. And unless a remedy is soon applied, anarchy and confusion will inevitably ensue. Washington is giving us a very perilous prediction here. If we don't fix this, and if we don't fix it soon, we're damned. We're done. This thing we call America is over. You guys, we don't appreciate that. As we look at America today, you're used to the America that you grew up in. The America of nuclear weapons, part of the winning forces of World War I and World War II, the powerful nation of the world, the policeman of the world. You're used to a very strong, emboldened America. It's hard for us to conceive of these 13 fragile, infantile nations trying to struggle for their first breath and learning to crawl, waiting for every violent affair in the world to come and kill them. It's hard for us to conceive that. And Washington is sitting here saying, yeah, fine, we won the revolution, but everything we fought for is falling through our fingers because we can't fix it. Everything we champion is being lost because our government is ineffective to secure it. Guys, we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. We fought 20 years in Afghanistan. And our government could not produce stability enough to hold on to the gains we had. We were building hospitals and schools. We were liberating women and children. We saw women voting in Afghanistan. When people say we had no progress in Afghanistan, I will humbly challenge you on that narrative. We did. We had a lot of progress. But insufficient leadership, inconsistency in our leadership, caused us to pull back, make very bad decisions, fight one-year wars over and over and over again, until we finally did the same thing we did in Vietnam 40, 50 years ago, where we pulled out and showed everybody that trusted America, you were a fool for trusting us. Our government cannot produce consistent results anymore. Why? Is it because we've become too democratic? Is it because the people have too much power? Is it because when we voted in 2020 and 2016 and 2008, we weren't voting on behalf of the people of Afghanistan, we were voting only on behalf of our own selfish being? To hell with the women and children of Afghanistan. We're having Pride Month in America so we can celebrate and run around with our rainbow scarves and whatnot. What about gay men and women in Afghanistan? They're first tortured, and then they're killed. Many of them have their entire biological reproductive systems mutilated first, because it is such an abomination. Do we care about gay rights, or we just care about American gay rights? What government do we have? It says 13 sovereignties pulling against each other, and all tugging at the federal head will soon bring ruin to the whole. This is going to end. It's going to end. Governor Hammond Randolph, shoot.
So when we were over there, I think it was I think we did with a lot of self-sabotage. Not self-sabotage, we sabotaged by their own people. So I know personally that we got shot in the back or in a firefight because we're just Iraqi police.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be on our side, and we landed with like, oh, the accident. So
Yeah.
situations like that.
Well, here's the thing, like, I understand a lot more than a lot of people understand. Like, I've studied that extensively, but going into that war, you were never going to win that war in a year. You were never going to win that war in 10 years.
Right.
The biggest reason we lost that war is you cannot go from Bill Clinton to W. Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden. The world was told very different things about what America championed. And so a lot of that was, if I'm Iraq and I believe that the American forces cannot be trusted, now you have to start acting in such a way to preserve your interest, because if America pulls back and they can't be trusted, now any of you that have sided with America, like the Iraqi forces, they are now going to be left in the cold against an Iran, which is much more powerful in the region. So that comes from a lot of the strategic calculations that they have to make based on their underlying philosophies, based on the long-term preservation. And if America cannot claim, no, we will be consistent and we will be here until the job is done. Bush said we will. Obama said, maybe. And so when did we start seeing all the waffling? When did we start seeing the backtracking? A lot of that happened with the inconsistent messaging. Donald Trump comes in and says, no, we will, and we're going to go on our terms. We're not going to be patient. We're going to be done now. And if I need to, I'll negotiate with terrorists. And then Biden comes in and says, no, we're out. We're done. Guys, if you played your cards right in Afghanistan, you never joined sides with America. And if you never joined sides with America, you're now part of the controlling entity. If you join sides with America, you bet wrong. You bet wrong. And so when we look at that war, that conflict, why? Guys, our democracy. What did we produce? W. Bush, we're going to make the world safe. We're going to protect the world. We will show no differentiation between nations that harbor terrorists and terrorists themselves. Obama, America is a disease, a curse in the world. We have done only harm. We've only been interested in pursuing our own agenda and our own platforms. Trump, America first, screw all of you. Biden,
Wow.
Guys, but the honest thing with Biden is, I don't think we can disconnect the fact that Biden lost a son in the war and the father's desire to get out of the war. That never came up, and nobody wants to talk about that. But can Biden effectively make a qualified decision on the war? That's an insanely difficult thing to expect from a human being to do. Make no mistake, there's a lot more going on there than we want to believe. Shoot.
Did that same narrative go for Bush?
Do what?
Did that same narrative go for Bush? Which one? The same analogy that you made as far as between Biden and his son, so it's compromised.
Well, Bush never lost a son though.
No, he didn't. But however, it's nothing like a son's love for his father.
Okay, yeah, gotcha. That's what you're saying. Like, was W. Bush compromised by the legacy of his father? Yeah, I would say overwhelmingly we see elements in there. And I would argue I don't think W. Bush was qualified for the office either. I think he learned in the office, but I think he took some poor advice early in his administration. I think he would argue that as well, based on his memoirs. But again, he won the system. If we don't correct the system of selection, then we're going to have this continued roller coaster ride. As long as we have this continued roller coaster ride, if you were in Afghanistan, who would you trust? The American government or Putin? Who's been there longer? Who's stronger? If you had a fist fight right now, if we put him in an arena, who wins? Putin or Biden? Guys, we don't like that. We don't like that because we're going to say, oh no, God, Putin is so terrible, he's so evil. In a Hobbesian system, there is no evil. It's about preservation and survival. Putin does what's necessary for Russia to be surviving. For Putin, the worst thing Russia ever did was trust America. When we ended the Cold War, and the Russian leaders at the time had the audacity of trusting American leadership, for Putin, that was the worst, stupidest thing that the Russian leaders could have done. They dropped their defenses, they trusted a foreign nation, and what did that foreign nation do? Governor Emmett Randolph, our chief danger, what's wrong with the articles? Arises from the democratic parts of our Constitution. What's the problem with the democratic parts? We've become too democratic. He says, it is the maxim which I hold to be incontrovertible, that the powers of the government exercised by the people swallow up all the other branches. None of the Constitution have provided sufficient checks against the democracy. If we are going to progress as a nation, we have to perceive that democracy is the problem, not the solution. A pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit no cure for the mischief of faction. What is the greatest evil that tends to manifest in democrat societies? He argues factional control, and specifically shenanigans on the part of factions. Factions are political parties, political interests. Democracies cannot account for the evil that manifests in political parties, because political parties or factions end up being the controlling entities of the mob. Take a break. I'll see you in 5.